Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Ryan the Ride Mechanic channel. How the heck are you doing today? On today, if you're watching it on the day I release this, it is Valentine's Day. That's right, February 14th, the day you're supposed to be getting that special someone in your life a gift or something like that. I hope you did. Otherwise, you're in trouble. How about this poem? Roses are red, violets are blue. It's fucking cold outside, so let's talk about it.
Now get ready. Here we go.
If this is your first time here, make sure you like and subscribe, do all that stuff downstairs. It does help me out. I do appreciate it. All right, it is flipping cold outside. Holy crap, I want to talk about this. All right, I've done a video like this in the past on weather, and whether or not you remember it, I know that was bad, right? I do want to talk about this because it's number one thing that comes up during this time of year. It's like there are parks that are closed, there are parks that are open, so you got both sides of the spectrum. What do rides dislike about weather conditions? So it doesn't have to be cold, it can be hot, it could be rain, it could be snow, it could be all sorts of stuff. So I kind of want to touch on those topics today. Let's start with the elephant in the room. All right, outside it is 0 degrees outside. Very cold. Can rides operate in 0-degree temperature? Well, yes. The majority of rides can operate in 0-degree temperature and even colder than that. Some unwanted byproducts of that, though, is you typically tend to valley the train because the grease in the wheels becomes too thick at that temperature. So parks that try to ride the spectrum and have both sides of running that ride at cold and hot, they have to do things like when the train comes to a stop in the station or in transfer, they have to try to warm the wheels up and keep them warm. I know there are a handful of rides out there where the rails in the station have been, they're hollow to start with, but they have been tapped on both sides and they pump fluid inside the rail. When it gets cold outside, they pump warm fluid inside there, typically like an ethylene glycol or something like that. And then when it gets cold, they simply warm that mixture up and get it nice and hot and run it through those rails as general. While the train is sitting there, some of that heat from the rails is radiating upward through the surface of that road wheel, guide wheel, upstop wheel, and trying to keep those bearing worms. Other things that have been used are infrared style heaters underneath the station, trying to keep those wheels warm as well as they sit there. The easiest thing to do if you're trying to keep the wheels running in very cold temperatures is to simply replace the grease with a very, very thin grease or even a oil, and that way the wheel bearing doesn't have to worry about it. The train slows down a minimal amount. So one of the other things that comes up is, can you safely run the ride in this weather? Safely. What does safely mean? It's like, at what point in time does the patron or guest riding your roller coaster start to get damage to their face and everything else? By that I mean riding a roller coaster at, say, 60 miles per hour at 0-degree temperature, you're going to start getting frostbite on your nose and cheeks and things like that really fast. You have to worry about your guests being able to handle those wind chill factors as they're out on the track. The other thing is that you have people operating the ride, so parks that might not be used to very cold temperatures all the time might have trouble literally keeping the crew warm. That might be a big deal, so they might have to start doing a special staggered rotation where the crew comes in and they start operating the ride, and literally every 5 minutes they have to rotate positions so that after 30 minutes they can rotate out of the ride and go somewhere and warm back up. That way you have, let's say, a handful of people that are constantly going out, coming back and getting warm to operate the ride again.
Big summer blowout?
So other than wheel bearings on a ride, what else is affected by cold temperature? It's like, well, luckily, most of the mechanical equipment, when you talk about drives, motors, and things like that, they prefer to run cooler than hotter. They don't have too much troubles, but changing the bearing grease out on a drive motor is not really an option. So one thing you might have is that in cold mornings, when the bearing grease is really frozen up nice and solid, you might actually start to damage the bearings on things like lift motors and things like that. Also not uncommon for big DC motors and equipment like that to be equipped with heaters in them in general to keep moisture out of the inside. So they might already have a heater system, And then you can also do things like put those components inside sheds and containers to make sure they're also warm during this time of year as well. The characteristics of a train running through cold weather is not that uncommon of just normal temperatures in general. The train will slow down. They'll start to behave much more sluggishly around the track as all the tolerances start to tighten up and the materials just start to move very stiff around there. So you will lose some speed out of there, but some rides are meant to be run in this temperature and they have no problem with it. There's plenty of videos of rides running, especially over in places where they get lots of snow, and you'll see them clearing snow off the track just by running the train around. I have mixed opinion on that. I don't think that's a good idea, but again, I'm not from a park that had to deal with that constantly, so it must be an okay thing to do unless the snow compacts into ice, then you've got troubles. But realistically, these parks where they get snow, the temperature typically hovers right around that point where snow can stick on the ground. So in the US here, we deal with Fahrenheit. The temperature is very close to the 32 degree mark, right around where water freezes. 0 Celsius, right? You stay within that like 10 degree temperature window right there, you can get snow, it can stick around the ground, but you can still run the ride just fine. If you were to put a ride out here in Omaha, Nebraska, it might get, well, you might have snow on the ground, but it also might be negative 15 outside. So if I were to ever say, hey, I want to build an amusement park out here and run it during the wintertime, this would where I take the note from a lot of people and say I want to build an indoor amusement park. I want to cover it up. I want to have lots of buildings so that everything is indoors. People come inside and I could keep my equipment running at a set known temperature. It's always going to be between, I would say, 55 and 70, depending on where the AC units and temperature units are for the building. One of the things to remember is that let's take your attention away from big major type roller coasters and saying, well, what else is affected? Well, actually flat rides, what I consider flat rides, a lot of them are actually affected for both cold temperatures like snow and ice and rain. They kind of hit the same metric there. Most flat rides depend on you getting on and off of the gondola in a very exact spot. Some of these rides have floors where they're twisted up at the ends, or they're maybe at an odd angle to where you kind of have to climb up an incline a little bit to get on your seat or something like that. So that is one of those things that if it becomes frozen and icy or wet and slippery, you can't make those inclines. So that would cause those rides to shut down during the wintertime. Turning our attention back to roller coasters, however, people ask, like, do the brakes still work? It's like brakes work just as well as they do on a cold day as they do on a hot day. They might produce different effects, like the first couple of times through the brakes, they might make weird noises going through there as all the brass is really cold. But once it gets a couple bites into the brass, they start warming up. It's okay. Eddy current brakes or magnetic brakes, they work just fine because nothing really changes with those. As the fin passes through the magnetic shoe, the fin becomes hotter, but in this temperature, it just dissipates that heat right back out into the air. No big deal. On a normal summer day, when you encounter a magnetic brake fin, those things can be very hot to the touch. So a lot of times they have warning on them that says, caution, hot, do not touch. Because there's really no way for that heat to dissipate out of them aside from just running out on the track. Okay, let's talk the extreme now. Let's go the opposite direction. Let's talk heat now.
Nice dissolve.
Because this video is about weather, whether you like it or not. Let's talk about heat that builds up in the rides. Let's go to, right, from 0 degrees. Now let's go to a hot summer day where it is 100 plus degrees outside and the humidity's up there and it is just a general nasty hot summer day outside. Can rides run in this temperature? Yes, they can. You also have a handful of problems to deal with. Most of them are very ride specific and installation specific. So the manufacturer doesn't know really what you're going to do with these things on their end. They provide them to you and say, here's the basic stuff. You got the rest of it. So you have to think of things like when your train's sitting there for a long period of time in direct sunlight, most parks opt for black shoulder restraints. They opt for black shoulder restraints because they don't look as nasty once they get all dirty, and you can clean them and they stay relatively cleaner looking longer. So a lot of parks do that, but the thing is, on the hot summer day, those restraints get really hot. All those components start to get hot, and then you could start running into a problem where guests touch them and they're like, ow, that's too hot. That goes for anything in the train. The sides where people like to hold the coach as they get inside and things like that, that coach can become very hot. So it's necessary a lot of times to shield things. Talk about the brakes. The brakes work just fine on a hot day. They don't really have any issues. So the grease gets nice and warm. The brake function works great. Nice open, nice close. But you could run into things where some of those smaller components, the electric components, could start to overheat. Is that a thing where we need to cool components down? Typically not. Actually, when you get electrical components that don't behave well and when it starts getting hot outside, that's actually generally a function of that component failing. It's typically not a problem like, oh, that's just hot, it needs to cool back down. That's typically a function of that unit is on the edge of failing and the temperature makes it start to fail. At that point, you pretty much just want to replace those components because they should be able to handle temperatures that the rest of us can handle. That shouldn't be an issue for those type of rides. Now, some very sensitive electronic components can start to have all sorts of troubles. For instance, drives, PLC processors, things like that, things that belong inside of control rooms. Those belong inside of control rooms because they are sensitive to hot and cold. Not so much cold, but mainly hot. When those things get too hot, the electronics stop working the way they're supposed to on the inside. So when the ride starts developing weird faults and things like that on a hot day, the first thing I ask the mechanics is the control room sealed up and is the air conditioning on in the control room, trying to keep that control room nice and cool so all those things can work properly. Newer equipment installed that use things like brake resistors and brake choppers for rides that have to do their own regenerative braking, those things are typically put into separate rooms. That way they can have their own cooling and they can dissipate their own amount of heat inside that room, and they don't have to worry about all that next to the PLC and controller and the real sensitive stuff over there. Just like your cold days, hot days also has its effect on the crew itself. The crew, just like extreme cold days, you will have to start rotating your crew out so they can cool back down, or at least get them to a cool shaded area so they can drink water and cool back down. Your guests run the same problem. If you have built a queue line that's just out in the middle of nowhere with no shade over the top of it, I know a lot of parks that do that. It seems to be a very common thing, smaller parks especially. Then your people are just sitting in a straight sunlight queue, getting heat stroke, sunstroke, all sorts of stuff, and they will tend to pass out in the queue line because most people go from ride to ride and they don't stop to properly hydrate during those hot summer days. You have to keep your hydration level up as a guest in a park, and that is not the thing that a lot of people want to do. They get off of one ride, the adrenaline's going, and it's like, what's the next ride we want to do? I do it myself. What's the next thing we want to do? All right, let's go there, and you make a beeline for that next ride. You are not thinking about that. Well, remember how tired I was and thirsty I was just 10 minutes ago before I got on the ride? Tired and thirsty, those are two warning signs right there. It's like hot, tired, thirsty? Yeah, you're going to want to get to a cool, dark place, start sipping on some water. But you don't remember that once you get off that ride and all that adrenaline's flowing through your veins. It's just like, let's go to the next one. So your amount of guest injuries on a hot day start to rise up. And the roller coasters themselves, they love the hot temperatures because all the tolerances open up, everything starts to loosen, and those trains start to run super fast out there on the track. Now, humidity gets in the way of that. Humidity is literally, it's water in the air. It will slow a train down to some extent. So not something really noticeable that you can see, but if you sit there with a timer and time an empty train on a humid hot day versus a dry hot day, you will get different lap times out of the same train. They go different speeds. So typically what you want is a hot, dry environment to get the train to go its fastest speed around the track. That can produce other problems with the braking system, because now you might have a fast running train and the ride's not ready for it. So the ride might fault and produce other things saying, hey, that train's going too fast. Now you might have to have a maintenance crew come out to figure out how to slow that train back down. Easiest way to slow a train down is to pump more grease into the wheels. That's also the first thing that you have to worry about once it starts getting cooler on the other side. So it's kind of like a never-ending maintenance nightmare. For rides that use all nylon wheels, you can take nylon wheels and replace them with urethane wheels once you get into the summertime. The train runs smoother. It's a much better deal all the way around, but you are replacing wheels left and right with all this other stuff. So depending on the size of your spare part budget, you might not have an extra 100 urethane wheels sitting in inventory to just rotate into. Some parks might. That might be the thing they want to do. So that's what they're going to stock their inventory to do. Lots of nylon wheels in the cold time to make the train run faster, and lots of urethane wheels in the summertime to slow the train back down to keep it in that right speed. Again, the train's got to be in that right speed, because if you have a lower height restriction especially, that faster speed is going to put more g-force on the rider, and you might be exceeding the requirements that those restraints were actually built for that ride. So you want to make sure the train has to stay inside of a window. If the manufacturer has specified a window, it needs to stay inside of it. If the manufacturer never specified a window, you might be open to artistic interpretation of the speed of the ride. Flat rides, of course, really don't like heat in general because they don't have a good way to dissipate that heat. They sit in one spot, typically in a very bright open area, and they just retain that heat the more that gets put on it. They don't have advanced cooling systems around their controllers and drive equipment. They don't have cooling systems around their drive motors. They just sit there and work in that hot temperature. So flat rides have a much harder time dissipating their heat out of that, and then you start running into other problems with them as well. More controller based around those rides because everything is hot to the touch. You can open up control cabinets that are literally hot to hold. And it's like, how is that equipment on the inside working with a sealed cabinet, no air circulation or anything, when it's hot to the point where a mechanic can't even go there and touch the outside of that cabinet? That's pretty hot. Not good to do. So again, this is for flat rides. This is one of the reasons why they like to install little shacks or sheds nearby to put some of their control equipment inside there. It makes it nice to where when you have to go work on things, you have a little room there where you can just open everything up and get to the wiring. You don't have to worry about overhead, sunlight getting in there too much, people photographing you, trying to I'm going to put this on my YouTube channel. I don't know who would do that. And you don't have to worry about things like, well, if I leave this cabinet open and it's pouring down rain outside, I don't have to worry about getting wet on the inside because it's covered. I don't have to worry about that. So it's a better thing if your ride has a little standalone area to shield some of its more important electronics, which in the grand installation of purchasing a ride and installing it, a little shack off to the side typically doesn't break the bank for installations. It's more of can the area visually handle it? And that is more up to the park. So we've talked about some extreme colds. We've talked about some extreme hots. Let's talk about rain. Is always one of those subjects that comes up. People go to parks on a rainy day and a lot of rides close down in the rain. So why do rides close in the rain? Are they not safe to operate in the rain? Well, some of them are not safe to operate in the rain. Some of them are, but they still close down anyway. So there are other things that cause hazards to the employees running it, where they should not be operating that ride in the rain. The employees need a dry, safe place to stand in the rain. If they don't have that, then the park doesn't probably want to let those rides operate like that because their employees are just sitting there getting soaked to the bone, and they don't want that. So the employees need a nice covered place to stand. If that covered place is open to rainwater getting onto their control panel and everything else, then you might have a problem with the control panel. A lot of the control panels are not really rated to be outside in the rain, just in the middle of a rainstorm. They're not rated for that. The push buttons are weather resistant, but they're not weatherproof. So what that means is that, yes, you can safely operate that button when it starts getting wet, but if you just start saturating that panel with a lot of rain, then you could run into the chance of electrocution, and it could start seeping inside. A lot of control panels have another PLC just inside. Even more control panels these days have touch screens on the front where you definitely don't want those touch screens wet. So that might be one of those things like, okay, when you have that touch screen and a bunch of buttons there, and if the ride doesn't have a sufficient house built around the outside of it, you might just want to say, okay, you know what, never mind. Let's just close this one down during the rain, and we don't want the operators messing with anything. Around the operator station, there is also the issue of that walk path, like I was talking about a little bit earlier. A lot of rides, flat rides especially, have platforms that curve up for things that rotate. Around simple spinning rides, you might have little hills you have to go up and down as you walk around that spinning ride. On top of the ride, a lot of times they use like diamond sheet metal up there that makes a walk surface. Well, walk surfaces on the ride or around the ride getting slippery is the number one reasons why rides shut down in the rain. If you have an angled platform, we used to operate a Hawk 48, Zamperla Hawk 48, and the platform on both ends had like a 30-degree angle on both ends of the platform. It was corrugated metal, so it had plenty of traction on it. But when it started to get wet, it started getting slick. So operating that ride in the rain wasn't really a good option for us, because as those 30-degree inclines would start to get slick, the employees that had to go up and down that platform constantly started running into more of a chance slipping and falling. Now, we care a lot about the employees to make sure they're safe, but we also care a lot about the guests. The guests have to be safe as well. As much as it was a pain in the butt going up and down those slopes at a 30-degree angle while it was slick, trying to jump off of a seat and land onto that slope at the same time was spelling almost certain disaster for guests. So just in general, they're like, you know what, once this starts raining, we're going to take this ride and shut this down, because it's not worth running this ride in the rain. They didn't want the lawsuits, guest injuries, employee injuries, or anything else happening from that. So then let's talk about brakes. So let's talk about brakes for rides. Do brakes work in the rain? For the most part, they do. Some not so great. But for the most part, yes, the brakes work just fine in the rain. Now, the majority of big roller coaster brakes, let's say we'll bring up magnetic brakes, they work perfectly fine in the rain. They don't care if they're submerged in the water. Like Jurassic Park ride at Universal Studios Hollywood, the brakes are submerged underneath water. So those brakes literally work underwater. No problem for magnetic brakes at all. Pinch brakes typically work just fine whether they're dry or whether they're wet. There's really hardly any imbalance to pinch brakes once they start working. What you start running into trouble with is mechanical friction brakes like you would get from drive tires. Some rides, when they come in, they slow down and they get into drive tires, and the drive tires has to slow them down and stop them the rest of the way. When rubber gets wet and starts pushing against the side of the coach or maybe the bottom of the coach, sometimes that surface doesn't handle water well. And some rides acknowledge that, and they have rain modes. I remember our RMC coaster, it used rubber drive tires to bring the train in and slow it down and stop it. Well, we acknowledge the fact that in the rain, those rubber drive tires might get really wet and they might not work so great. They're going to lose their efficiency to both accelerate and deaccelerate the train, meaning harder starting and stopping. So what we did is we installed a rain mode for the ride. So we said we wanted a profile to ramp up and deaccelerate. So accelerate, deaccelerate. And we selected those profiles, and when we selected rain mode, those profiles would change. Instead of being sharp curves up and down, they started being more like these slow slopes up and down. So the drive had longer to accelerate, still got it to its max speed that it needed to go, but it had longer to get there, and it took longer to deaccelerate the train back down to where it needed to go. So drive tires and booster tires around station areas is typically the one thing that rain really affects. And if those are your sole source of stopping in those areas, then yes, it affects the brakes in those particular areas. One of the byproducts of rain on roller coasters is that the majority of time, to a certain extent, the roller coaster will speed up once it gets wet. While the train is out there on the track, as you push a train over the lift hill and it starts going down, all the wheels on there have to accelerate. Well, there's a lot of wheel bearing resistance, a lot of grease resistance, and everything else, so you need a lot of energy to speed all that equipment up. When you make the track wet, most of the time those wheels don't actually speed up, they start sliding over the surface, kind of like it was greased. They start sliding over the surface of that instead of actually rotating up to it. So what you get is that as a train crests and starts rolling down the drop, the wheels might have to speed up to their max speed. Let's just say their speed up to, well, you measure wheel RPM. Say that wheel goes up to 2,000 RPM. At 2,000 RPM, that's its max speed. Well, when you get the track wet and saturate it with water, the wheel might not get to 2,000 RPM. It might get up to like 1,200 RPM before it starts curving and going up the other way, which means the train is literally sliding over the track. So it accelerates a lot faster and it goes faster out there on the track as well. So one of the things rain modes do on rides is they carefully push the train over the top. They might not go as fast as they should over the top. They go slower because they know the train's going to go faster throughout the course. The first time I saw this was in testing of our RMC. They were out testing it at nighttime. Very uncommon to our area, because we were in a drought area, was a rainstorm suddenly came through. And the engineer and the person testing it at the time said, "I wonder how the ride performs in rain." And they said, "Well, it should go faster." Yeah, it should go faster. They had one train on the track. They were still testing the system. They were running a train around, but they were still testing the system. Lots of sensors, starts and stops, and all that sort of stuff. Lots of boring things to do when you're by yourself at nighttime. So they said, okay, let's send this train over. So they sent it over there, and he said, I wanted to test the difference between what it would happen normally and what would happen in rain mode. So he wanted to test his modes difference right there. So he said, okay, so he sent the train over the lift hill, and the thing just blew through the course, just absolutely flying, where I think they were getting 46-second lap times or something around there. I don't remember what the exact times were, but we'll say like 46 seconds, where they were getting 46 seconds lap times out of that train during their testing. They sent that one over, and it came in at like 38 seconds, like 8 seconds faster. They got the pants scared off of them completely because it came in and they had none of the brakes or anything adjusted, but the ride was working just fine, but they weren't fully adjusted. So it came in and actually blew through brake zone 1, blew through brake zone 2, and then came around and came all the way through the station and stopped halfway out of the station. It almost penetrated every single block on the ride. It was going that fast. So that was an interesting story we got the next day. It was like it blew through everything. It just went through the brake, through the station. It was just like, holy crap. This wasn't an expected outcome. This was an unexpected outcome. But when they say, well, why was it so unexpected? It's because they didn't have anything set. They were working with a partial control system. The brakes weren't set to the proper tension, and by that I mean magnetic brakes weren't set to the proper force. The booster wheels weren't really set to their maximum crush. They were just kind of closed. They had a lot of things just halfway working. They were just curious what the speed was going to be like on the train, the difference between those two. And they got their answer. So where it sent the train over the top at, let's say, 5 miles per hour on a normal ride cycle, when you switched it into a rain mode, once it started to crown the top of the lift hill, the drive slowed almost all the way back down to a complete crawl and just barely let the train go to try to slow it as much as possible. And then that same ride, we installed a warm-up as well, to where instead of crawling over and not 5 miles per hour over, we got it over at like 10 miles per hour as fast as we could make that drive go to get it through when you had like cold bearings and things like that needed to be worked out on the ride. So rain plays a bigger part in the ride's function than most people think, but it's still not quite a safety issue unless you're dealing with lots of rubber drive tires that have to slow down the train to stop it. Then you might be dealing with a safety issue. I know a lot of the Intamin rides like to do that. They bring the train down, they slow it, and then that last slow to a stop is done with booster wheels. and they like to use those, and I think they put too much effort on those booster wheels. B&Ms kind of do the same thing sometimes, but they bring the train in at a very slowed and controlled pace. The one I'm thinking of when I say Intamin, I think of like Millennium Force, where that thing just kind of rockets to a stop right behind the other train, and it kind of like, every time I see that, I'm like, oh man, it's gonna crash, but it doesn't. At least not all the time. So we've talked about cold temperature, we've talked about hot temperatures, we talked about snow, we've talked about rain. Ooh, let's talk about wind. Seems like a fun park, but there's only a couple rides running right now because it's so windy. So behind me is the Monster. This thing's been down all day due to weather because it's been too windy. I don't want to say that they should be running it because I've made my fair share of bad decisions in this situation. Most rides, roller coasters especially, have very strict wind guidelines. Now, the manufacturer typically does not create these guidelines because they don't know what your overall package is going to be. The manufacturer says that the train should be between these speeds while it's out there on the track. They don't know which end of the spectrum you want it to run at. So like a lot of parks choose to run all nylon wheels on their B&M rides, and they get those trains running as fast as they can around that course. That's up to the park. As long as it stays within the guidelines B&M says it has to be in, which I'm assuming is set by the technician installing the ride. I'm assuming he's got that guideline because I've never seen it in person, but that's neither here nor there. As long as it's between those windows, B&M's fine with it. So on our particular floor list that we ran from B&M, we wanted that running much slower. We always wanted it on the slow end because it made the ride much more comfortable. It was also much easier on the equipment itself. We tear up less bearings, we tear up less wheels. It was nice and easy on the track, even though the track was way overbuilt, but it was still easier on all the equipment. So we ran things on the slower end, and it was nice and quiet too, while other parks run things on the really fast end where they get really noisy. You get that B&M scream out of those things because of all the nylon wheels running on them. So one of the things that we had to do is we said, okay, we had to do wind testing and figure out which end of the spectrum we can operate the ride in. Now, for the longest time, we never really had a defined window of what it could operate in. I believe in the manufacturer's manual, they stipulated not to operate in more than 35 mile an hour winds, but I'm trying to recall this number. I think it's something around 35 mile an hour winds. But it wasn't something that was sustained or gusting, which could the ride handle gusting at 35 or was it sustained at 35? What was the problem? The park in general started watching wind when it got up to around 25 miles per hour. They started staying in real good contact with all the roller coasters and saying, who is out, what are the rides doing? How do they look? How are they working right now? And the operators will report back, yeah, it's running like normal. We don't see any problems. And they'd say, okay. And I remember the one day I valleyed the B&M coaster, that's what it was. It was really windy, and the mechanic called me up. He says, can I send it? And I was like, yeah, this doesn't seem too bad. Go ahead and send it. Well, that was the wrong answer, and it valleyed. But a lot of parks out there have a wind window narrowed down to almost the degree. So I know Magic Mountain, they get a lot of winds that come in from the hills, and they're sudden and strong. So almost every one of their rides has an anemometer to measure wind speed at the top of it. And they say if it goes over this, they tell them not to send the train. They're like, do not send that train over once it goes past this number. With people on, it's like, okay, just slow down and stop operation. But if the mechanic's there and the ride's unloaded, especially in the morning time, if it's close to that number, they just won't open the ride. They're like, nope, I'm not going to send it. They've recovered those rides so many times in that park. They know exactly where their red line is, and they know to push the rides up to that line and not over it, because over it means it valleys out there on the track. Nobody wants a valley coaster. That sucks a lot. So they know, okay, take your ride, go up to here, don't go over. If you need to go over for some reason, then you need like a manager's permission to send it over the top. Most of your smaller rides are very unfazed by wind, although the manufacturer does specify for those as well that once they get past a certain category of wind, not to operate the ride. And the majority of that, I'll use Zamperella's manuals as a reference. Zamperella says on there not to operate past, like, they give their own category with wind speeds on there, but it's dang near 40 mile per hour winds or something like that. And they give you references because not all places there's a lot of traveling rides, and they sell these rides as traveling rides, and they go to just Joe Blow operator that might not have anemometers to get accurate wind speed back, or they might be using their phone to Google local wind speeds. So Zamperla says, hey, when you start breaking branches off of trees, when leafy branches start falling from trees, I believe that's the exact words. When leafy branches start falling from trees, that is the time to stop operation of the majority of Zamperla's rides. They're like, all right, the wind's too fast, you better stop. Because I believe at that point it's easy enough just to say, hey, if you've got branches breaking off of trees, then what's to prevent a tree falling? Now, a tree falling on a ride sucks, and it's happened before. A tree falling on an operating ride with people on it is disastrous. So they definitely don't want to do that. That is one of the things that when you have weather, you have to take in all these other things that the ride manufacturer never thinks of. Can you operate it in snow? It's like, well, yeah, you could operate it in snow if you wanted to. But if the park has strung up a canopy over a section of the ride, and like by putting snow on that canopy, now you have taken those metal cables and drape them 3 feet off the track, where it's a sure final destination scene where everyone's head gets cut off, like the beginning of Ghost Ship, then you might not want to do that. But the manufacturer had no way of knowing that you were going to do such a thing. So it's those weird little things like that. Rain causes slippery surfaces on something that the manufacturer didn't know. Maybe your exit for the queue line is a long grade all the way down that you made out of plastic for some reason. And as soon as that stuff gets wet, it turns into a giant slide. Fun for kids, not for everyone else. That would be a reason to shut the ride down. So a lot of these ride shutdowns for weathers are things that the manufacturer never knew about and never intended. That's just stuff the park did. It's something that the operator is doing. So you have to be really careful about who you blame when the ride goes down, because it's not necessarily really cut and dry. We had a Star Flyer from Funtime. That thing worked just fine, but you got it in the wind and it would start getting overspeed faults. So it would go up there, and every once in a while the wind would catch it just right and cause it to accelerate its speed. And then it would overspeed and shut down. So you'd have everyone stuck up there at the very top, because that's typically where it was, and they were just getting blown around at the time because the ride went too fast. So the solution was to say, okay, let's go in and turn the final speed down. Instead of turning at, I don't remember what it was, let's say 9 RPM. Instead of turning at 9 RPM, let's turn it down to 8.7 RPM and get it away from that max speed. And then we went in there, the engineers did, they went in there and they widened the little safety envelope at that particular area. And they said, okay, let's make it a little bit wider to handle some wind gusts. Did that fix all the problems? No. It still shut down all the time for overspeed on a windy day. During a rainy day, would it run? Yes, it would run in the rain. Did it have problems? Yes, it did. It was the same thing. It would fault on acceleration, and it would fault on the deacceleration or deceleration on the way down. So it could fault on both ends of theirs, because those were just rubber drive tires against the inside of the star that would accelerate the thing. The cables going over the pulley sheaves, not so much. Those were fine. They would just head up and over those sheaves, but we did do stop testing and penetrant testing with those. Didn't really notice a difference on them. Minor measurements on those things, not a big deal for that. Let's talk about hail. Hail is a very dangerous thing for anybody in any condition. So typically rides don't operate in hail because you never want to accelerate anybody into hail balls. So it's just one of those things. If they know hail is in the area and they've got a chance for it, they typically stop operation of the ride. That falls under the lightning as well. Lightning is one of those atmospheric conditions that is very unpredictable. Florida has a lot of lightning strikes around their rides, and they pretty much know they could see the storm coming. Here it comes, and then once it gets close, they stop all operation of their rides. They let it pass over, and then they start them back up again. Is that a guaranteed every time? No, not a guaranteed. I know from when a lightning storm here in Nebraska comes around, once it comes by, where the bulk of the storm is, you can get lightning strikes up to 10 miles away. 10 miles. Like just one random lightning strike 10 miles away. So it's not something that you can predict easily. So typically once lightning is in the area or hail is in the area, you just stop operation. And along the lightning fronts, I know I've heard this a lot of times. It happens every park, every time, everywhere. You can ask any mechanic. Anytime lightning comes by, you always get a call from somebody that says blank ride was just hit by lightning. And it was not. It was not hit by lightning. You may think it was, but it was not. When a lightning strike hits a ride, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because my first-hand knowledge is nothing on it, but I've talked with people who have dealt with this. When lightning strikes a ride, it is not just boom, it struck the ride, and then you don't know, like we can't tell afterwards. The boss that I worked with, he worked at a park where lightning did strike a ride, and he said there was no mistake when you went up to that ride that lightning struck that ride. He says the top looked like somebody welded on top of it. The paint was all peeled away. He said all the way down the footer, all the way down the leg, the support leg of the column, paint was peeled all the way back on both sides like a channel going all the way to the ground. Most footers have grounding rods next to them in case they are struck by lightning. Some more than others, depending on how the ride's built. They actually have we want a lightning rod installed here and installed there. But he said where the lightning rod was connected at the base of the footer, he said there was nothing left. All that stuff went down there, and then that whole assembly that's driven down into the ground to take the current down there, he says it was just completely gone, and there was just splatter marks all over everything. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, he said, you knew that particular leg was hit by lightning. He said everything else, if you have to look and see hard, oh, did this get hit by lightning? I'm not sure. He's like, if you have that thought, it didn't get hit by lightning. Okay, I think that's about it for this video. Like, subscribe, do all that stuff downstairs. It does help me out. I do appreciate it. If you want to contact me, you can contact me at ryantheridermechanic@yahoo.com. That's my email. You could always comment down below. I try to make it through all the comments and see what's down there. Let me know what you thought about the video, whether you liked it or not, whether you had a good time or not. See how many times you could use weather in the sentence. That's it. Stay off the air gates. Bye.